Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we are back for another episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. And this might be one of my shorter ones since there's only been 5 new posts since the last time I made one of these, so let's get right into it. So first we have Canada votes for more of the same from CanadianDescent.ca, posted by Grass Taste Bada. And yeah, I personally don't really like who Canada voted for, the Liberals, because the modern Liberal, like the Canadian Liberal Party, aren't really liberal in the slightest. They're more leftist authoritarian than liberal. When a lot of people say liberal, they a lot of libertarians think like classical liberals from like the 1890s or 1900s. Well, the modern liberals aren't even remotely liberal, I would say. They're more leftist, progressive, authoritarian, who will take away all your rights and rights because, you're not being progressive enough, They'll always say, oh, I'm pro-choice, but, except when it comes to stuff like vaccines or, food dyes or something, that's why, you can't trust modern liberals, I would say, because, modern liberals aren't anything at all like classical liberals, that they are all progressive, woke authoritarians who want to bully all their cultural standards onto you. And yeah, personally, I don't think Canada had a good choice on the other side, though, because the only ever viable party looks to be the Conservative Party, and modern-day conservatism, is pretty much just liberalism, progressivism driving the speed limit, as Michael Malice says. Modern-day conservatism, what has conservatism conserved? It's pretty much, they're pretty much the liberals from 10 years ago, and yeah, that just goes to show you how, they'll still trade all your rights away. Maybe they'll do it slightly slower. Maybe they might try and enforce some right-wing cultural standards onto you as well. Like, the liberals have all their left-wing cultural standards, the conservatives have all their right-wing cultural standards. But it just goes to show you how, they'll just sell you out at a slower pace. And yeah, so personally, I don't think Canada had any good choices. I personally probably would have gone for the Conservatives over the Liberals, depending on who's in my riding. I guess, I know Canada's a Libertarian Party as well. I probably would go for the Libertarian candidate if I had one in my riding, but I don't know what riding I would live in if I would live in Canada. Regardless, I personally would consider Canada to be pretty much a failed state at this point. They let Trudeau run rampant for 10 years and imprison peaceful protesters during the Freedom Convoy, and now they have pretty much a new guy, Mark Carney, to buttfuck them. And yeah, I personally don't think it's going to be all that different. I personally don't like Trump's rhetoric to annex Canada, but I do think Canada is gonna fall soon, and maybe the U.S. will have to come in and take over. And yeah, personally, I think I don't really care for the U.S. government either. But, Canada is definitely somehow even worse along when it comes to, implementing the New World Order and having no freedom whatsoever and not being able to question the official narrative anymore. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have, without habeas corpus, an arrest becomes kidnapping, bail becomes ransom, and the innocent are all guilty. Does this sound like justice or tyranny? From Universal Truth X13, and that's a self-post that they made, and they added, without habeas corpus, an arrest becomes kidnapping, bail becomes ransom, and the innocent are all guilty. Does this sound like justice or tyranny, your opinion? And personally, I would say the current system we have, even with habeas corpus, is tyranny. Just because they give it a fancy Latin term doesn't make it any different. I would argue that an arrest is pretty much just a government-sanctioned kidnapping. Bail is just state-sanctioned ransom, and the state can determine all innocent people are guilty if it feels like it. And yeah, I would argue that the state is inherently tyrannical, even if they have habeas corpus in effect, because the state has a monopoly on the legal use of force, and they can justify using that legal use of force with pretty much however they feel like. They control the military, they control the police, they control the courts, and that just goes to show you how, a lot of progressives hate monopolies, but they're completely fine with the state being governmental monopoly, and that just goes to show you how they're not serious people. And yeah, so personally, I don't really care for all the rhetoric of getting rid of habeas corpus. I don't really care where Lincoln did it, but, the state can already justify whatever it feels like and arrest you for whatever reason it feels like, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. And so I don't think it would change too much just because they got rid of an official term. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Trump administration poised to accept Palace in the Sky as gift for Trump from Qatar. Sources from flip.it, and that's linked to an ABC News article, but from, that was posted by Ninja Lover. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for politics as international relations politics, or just any politics as a whole. It just stuff like this just shows it's all just inherently grifting and throwing money and gifts at people to get what you want. But if Qatar does want to give Trump an aircraft and he does want to accept, that's his decision. That's why I personally don't really care for the whole political system as it is currently. They say, oh, what are the other options? Anarchy, voluntary government, but currently, it just goes to show you, the politician class was just gonna, sell all your rights away, while acting like the other branch of the party is gonna do it, even though they both, will sell all your rights away for stuff like free gifts like, the massive aircraft that Trump's getting. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have police chase Holt's morning traffic at Bay Bridge Toll Plaza from Crom4.com. And that was a post by Spare Simeon, and they added, sovereign citizen uses the OJ method of escape. And yeah, personally, I think, if people do want to run from the police, I think they should be able to. Ultimately, people will justify what they justify regardless of the legal system in place. And yeah, if people want to justify running from the police, I think they should be able to. But, just because it doesn't matter if they're innocent or guilty or not, I would say. Just because the police say you've broken the law doesn't mean you actually have broken the law. And if you want to justify that, like our sovereign citizen friend here, you should be able to. I personally think I'm surprised there isn't a greater overlap between the libertarian movement and the sovereign citizen movement. It seems like we both want a lot of the same goals of individual governance and doing whatever we feel like justifying. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have GOP Senator introduces bill to make all porn a federal crime following Project 2025 playbook from Gizmodo.com, posted by Patom13, and that's crosspost from the Mo Politics subreddit. And yeah, personally, I know Mike Lee, the guy who's introducing the bill, he's one of the more libertarian senators, I would say, even if he is kind of backwards when it comes to porn. And yeah, I personally don't really care too much for porn. I do think the societal consequences have been very negative, and it's normalized a lot of bad stuff. But the libertarian position is, if you want to watch porn, that's on you. Just keep it to yourself. I would argue that even stuff like child porn or snuff films, I personally don't care for those. If it were up to my cultural standards, it'd be illegal. But if you weren't justify watching that, as long as you keep it to yourself, I think the libertarian position, as long as you weren't the one who originally created them, jack off to whatever you want to, I personally think you'd be fucking sick in the head. But the libertarian position is individual liberty, and that includes stuff that you might think is immoral, as long as no one's getting physically hurt. And yeah, I made a post about this on the Libertarian Party USA subreddit, and I said, if you're viewing this post on desktop and looks up at the gold bar at the top of the screen, just under the URL, you can go to the fourth comment, liberty-minded individuals with name listed as Utah Senator Mike Lee. Front page Reddit, of course, despises Mike Lee for his anti-porn stance. As I've said in the past, porn is practically the origin among the user base of Reddit, which tends to be very hedonistic, and that's definitely pushing I would disagree with on speaking as a libertarian who doesn't like enforcing their values on others, even if I would agree with him that the effects of porn on society at large have been largely negative, especially when it's never been easier to access than ever thanks to the internet. This gets me to my main point when would you personally say that a libertarian will be justified in forcing their values on others? I personally make the argument that the libertarian position is to look the other way unless you literally can't. For example, if I see a guy jerking off in public and he's doing it a fair distance away from me, I'll probably just carry on with my day. However, if he does it literally on top of me, I probably will yell at him to stop. I guess you can make the argument that you should tell him to stop regardless of his location relative to yours, but for me personally, I tend to be a pretty live and let live type of guy. As long as there's no one's in physical danger, I'm probably just going to keep to myself. And yeah, I do think the libertarian position is you can't save everyone from everything, and a big part of libertarians is realizing that. It's like, Holden Caulfield and Catcher in Their Eye, he says, in one of the passages, he says, I went down to by a different staircase and I saw another fuck you on the wall. I tried to roll off my hand again, but this one was scratched on with a knife or something. It won't come off. It's hopeless anyway. If you had millions of years to do it in, you couldn't rub off even half the fuck you signs in the world. It's impossible. And yeah, I do think there is a point for childlike innocence, but sometimes you can't protect all the kids in the world. You can only really protect your own kids, and that's very much the libertarian position. I think if parents want to ban their kids from watching porn, they should be able to. But people will justify if they justify. If they want to look at porn anyway, they'll justify if they justify there. And yeah, personally, I don't think this bill has any realistic chance of passing. Because I think it's pretty much unenforceable. And yeah, personally, I won't be surprised if we see, a lot of Reddit associates banning porn for more conservative positions, but I want to see more progressive politicians, maybe like Elizabeth Warren, come out in favor of banning porn as well in the future. Because, what do progressives increasingly love? Censorship. And what do they hate? Objectification of women. And that's increasingly what you see when it comes to pornography. And yeah, what I could see the progressives doing eventually is maybe making just straight porn illegal, while LGBTQ plus porn is fine, because they have to protect LGBTQ plus rights, because that's one of their things they obsess over. It's kind of like LBJ said, I'll have those N-words voting Democrat for 200 years. Obama kind of would have those. He seemed like he would say, I'll have those F-slurs voting Democratic for 200 years, because so that's why I do think the progressives could ban porn at some point as well, but I don't know if it'll probably only be straight porn instead of LGBTQ plus porn. And yeah, so I'll wrap it up kind of there. I personally, as I said, I don't really care for porn. I think its effects on society have been overwhelmingly negative. But if people want to do it and all parties involved consent, I think it should be able to. And if it's already been filmed, and even if it was unconsensual, people will justify if they justify. As long as you keep it to yourself and don't try and normalize it, I think it's okay. But that doesn't mean I have to think it's a good. It's an objective good. A lot of progressives these days. The problem for progressives is you can say you have a right to do whatever you want to, but I shouldn't have to think it's stunning and brave. Progressives they think if something's legal, it's an objective moral good, and same with conservatives, but progressives really have this problem, and I really don't really care for that. Just because something's legal does not make it an objective moral good. But right now the progressives think, if you send it all from me and don't say everything I do is stunning and brave, well, you're a fascist bigot, and that's personally rhetoric that I don't care for. And I think let's see if there's anything new on the subreddit. Looks like there isn't, so I think we're gonna wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.